power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. You may be seated. There was a time when the predominant question about Christianity centered around the question of truth. Is it true? Questions like, is the Bible a reliable historical document? Or is there historical evidence for the resurrection that Jesus actually bodily rose from the dead? Questions like, could a rational and scientific person come to the conclusion that there is a creator God? It's questions like those that are still relevant, but also questions that made apologetics so popular when I was growing up. Questions that I believe continue to be important, but are often not the primary question anymore. Today, the world around us doesn't tend to ask those questions because is Christianity true assumes that the Bible is even worth considering. We live in a drastically world that many of you grew up in. If you're a teenager in this room, you are growing up in a world wildly different than many of the adults in your life grew up in. We are in a post-Christian, post-modern, post-everything world, and because of changing mindsets about the way of our world and a Christianity that often looks very little like Jesus, Christianity has in large part been removed from the conversation. It's not even seen as one of the viable options. In fact, for some, it's seen as the least moral of the options. Hateful, exclusive, non-scientific, corrupt, hurtful. And so for the next 3 weeks, what I want to do is I want to talk about a better way. What I want to do is I want to give an honest diagnostic, a biopsy, if you will, of our world, of the religion of Christianity, and compare those and put those up against the way of Jesus. To pick apart some of the ways of this world, the mindsets of this world when it comes to how we view things like humanity and how we view things like freedom and self-denial and justice. And to do the same with the way Christians, not necessarily Jesus, but Christians, have often treated those same subjects. And I want to put all of that up against what the Bible calls the way of Jesus, what it means to follow Jesus. And I want us to ask the question, is the way of Jesus maybe a better way than all of the other alternatives? And so what I want us to do is I want us to evaluate all of that. Not to answer the question, is it true, but to come to the conclusion that I hope it's true. Instead of the question of truth, I want us to answer the question of goodness. Is it good? Is it beautiful? Is it a better way to live and to be? Blaise Pascal, the famous philosopher, once wrote this describing religion. He said, men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it might be true. To cure that, we have to begin by showing that religion is not contrary to reason. This would be the classic view of apologetics, that in order to help somebody come to the conclusion that the Bible is true, that God is real, you defend the faith in such a way that you can come to the conclusion that you don't have to throw your brain out the window to believe in a God or to believe in the Bible, that there is good evidence to it. In fact, some might even argue that it takes more faith to believe there is no God. But as you continue, I think it becomes more and more the question of our generation. You need to prove that it's worthy of veneration, should be given respect. And then next, it should be made lovable. Should make the good wish it were true, and then show that it is indeed true. I think more and more, the necessity of our own day and age is to help people wish it were true. To help people when they look to the church say, I don't know if I believe that, but I hope it's true. I don't know if I want all of that, but I hope the God they speak of is real, because I can't find that anywhere else. And so for some of you, you are looking for the evidence to believe that Jesus is real, that you don't have to throw your brain out the window. But for more and more, you just need to be convinced that it's good, that the way of Jesus is the best possible way to see the world, to see your own humanity, and to see a way to live. Tim Keller, who was a pastor who recently passed away, was a pastor in the city of New York, and honestly, probably one of the best Christian authors I've ever read. I could recommend almost every single one of his works. And he said this, he's an incredible author writing about apologetics, all kinds of things. And in his own context, the secular city of New York City, he said this about his own experience pastoring. He said, there's really no reason for me to get out the guns on the evidence for the resurrection, which is trying to show that Christianity is true if they don't want it to be true. But if I get them to want it, if they get to the place of saying, gee, wouldn't it be great if that was true, but is it? Then I can do my apologetics. Then I can defend my faith. That's what I want for us in this series. To put it all under the microscope and to consider that maybe the way that Jesus views humanity and justice and freedom and self-denial, that I hope that's true. That I hope that's the best possible way to live. And so today I want us to begin by Jesus' understanding in the way Jesus views humanity. There's a classic song that I'm pretty confident that whether you're Christian or not, that most of you are familiar with. It starts with a simple phrase that is also the title, Amazing Grace. Right? Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. What an odd line in such a popular song, right? Like, think about it. Most people, like an artist writing worship songs today, would often stay away from that kind of line. Like, because most of us we would have trouble with that. Like, if an artist is writing that, we'd be like, all right, like, take it easy a little bit. Like, you're being a little bit too harsh on yourself. And people already have a negative self-view of themselves. Like, maybe we shouldn't call ourselves wretched. Like, wretched? Like, think of all the connotations and the way you feel when you sing something like a wretch like me. Now, that word wretched is just another way of saying sin. It's speaking to the reality of sin. And what's interesting for us is when we talk about this word sin, when we talk about the idea of wretchedness, that if we do a cultural diagnosis of the world and of the church, there is an odd relationship that we have to sin. That I think for many, we are in denial of how wretched we really are. I think most of us live in denial of our own wretchedness. And it happens in different ways depending on what kind of groups you fall into. In the church, there's one sort of denial of wretchedness. In the culture, there's a whole nother denial of wretchedness. And so what I want to do is I want to take us to a section of Scripture that Jesus highlights this kind of attitude. His audience is particularly religious people who are following the ways of God, the Hebrew Scriptures. And Jesus wants to tell a story in order to highlight some of their own hypocrisy and their own denial of their wretchedness. And so in Luke chapter 18, it says this, beginning in verse 9, to some who were confident of their own righteousness. In other words, this is setting the context. It's religious people very confident that they are doing it right. They look down on everybody else. And Jesus told them a story. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee. Now, a Pharisee would be who Jesus' audience is. And so he's trying to paint this picture that there's one of them that are like you, and then the other one, a tax collector, is not like you. That's how they would hear this story. They would relate to the Pharisee. And it says about the Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like the other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. In other words, he's saying something like, well, I'm a Christian. I go to church. I read my Bible. I pray. Like I do all the things. Thank you that I'm not like those people. But the tax collector stood up at a distance. And he wouldn't even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And I can't help but, I even look, I picture his composure and the pain I feel imagining his inability to look up to heaven. But then Jesus says about him, he says, I tell you, this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. He went home right with God. That it was the man who couldn't look up to heaven that Jesus is lifting up his eyes towards the gaze of heaven. Jesus says, this man went home justified. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, Jesus tells this story to give a diagnosis to the hypocrisy of the religious leaders because they are not seeing their own wretchedness. They can see it in all kinds of other people, but they don't see it in their own lives. And I think that's true of all of us. Like, Christian or not Christian, we're really good at pointing out the flaws in other people. If your religion's Christianity, you tend to focus on how you are unlike that other group of people who don't believe like you do or are as moral as you do or don't believe that particular thing that's wretched and evil. But if your religion's something else, if your religion is politics, you focus on you're not like the liberals or you're not like those conservatives or whatever it is. If your religion is just being true to yourself, you're just thankful that you're so thankful that you are not oppressed like those other people who deny themselves of living their most authentic lives. Right? Denial makes us feel better about ourselves, but it's unrealistic in its view of the world. Jesus offers a better way. A way that I would suggest is not pessimistic, it's just realistic. It's an honest way, a way that I would suggest, like if we just pay attention to the data, like if you pay attention to the news stories, you pay attention to anthropology, sociology, all of the things, the data would bear out that there is something wrong. One author by the name of Francis Spufer describes it as the human propensity to screw things up. He uses more colorful language, but because of our audience, I'll save you. You can use your imagination to come up with the conclusion of what he said. But he describes it this way, that there is a human propensity to screw things up. That over and over again, you can see this pattern. That things happen, relationships break, hurt happens, violence happens, bloodshed happens. He describes it in a way saying we come to this realization at moments of our life, when a marriage ends, when a career stalls or crumbles, when relationships fade away and you only see a kid on the weekends, or a recreational drug habit turns out to have veto powers over every other area of your life. Or maybe a more mundane, you are lying in the bath and you realize you're 39 years old and what your life looks like is nothing like what you dreamed it would be. So if we observe the world, I think we can come to the realistic conclusion that there is a human propensity to mess things up. Wars keep happening. Bombs keep being dropped. Election cycles keep being toxic. Families end up broken through divorce and affairs. Kids keep growing up without parents. Racial tensions continue to divide neighborhoods and cities. Suicide numbers continue to be high. Or even if we simply observe ourselves, which is probably much harder to do because of our own denial. But sometimes I'm lazy. Sometimes I'm selfish. Sometimes I don't care what other people think. Sometimes I'd rather be on my phone with the people in my life. Sometimes I hurt the people I love. Sometimes I lie. Like if I just follow the evidence, there seems to be this continuing pattern that I screw it up. And what's interesting is that's the same storyline of the scriptures. Like starting in chapter 3, we see that pattern over and over and over and over again. That humanity screws it up by going their own way instead of God's way. That humanity commits murder and violence. That humanity tries to climb their way up to God, believing they know better than God. That humanity wants to have for themselves their own king instead of following God as king. That humanity over and over and over again tries to do it their own way, and it screws up. If we follow the evidence, I think we can't help but come to the conclusion that there is this human tendency. This tendency that the scriptures call the flesh or call sin. And so there are really two options with that. You can live in denial, or you can be set free by honesty. You can be in denial of the reality of wretchedness in this world and more particularly in your own life, or you can be set free by the humility that realizes it in your own life. Now, there are a couple ways I want to critique the way wretchedness gets played out in our world, in our culture, and in the church. The first would be in this idea that I will describe with the language of being true to yourself. Being true to yourself can be a denial of wretchedness. Now, I think this idea of being true to yourself, it's important. It plays out often in our culture. There are hints of truth in it. That's what makes it so powerful and appealing. The scriptures talk about living in your unique identity as a child of God and loving others as you love yourself, right? There's an important reality of how we view ourselves, but often in the axiom of being true to yourself, it most often in our world misses a reality. That if we were honest about ourselves, most of us have multiple selves that are fighting with each other. And so the question about if I'm trying to be true to myself, the question is, which self am I being true to? Am I being true to the version of myself who is loving and kind and patient and good? Or am I being true to the selfish, spiteful version of myself? In the book Live No Lies, John Mark Comer highlights this in a story of Woody Allen and his notorious affair with Soon-Yi Previn. Now, I don't know the story super well, but I want to highlight some pieces of it because I think it highlights the danger of denying wretchedness very well. And so Woody Allen was in the 80s, was in an on and off relationship with Mia Farrow. Woody Allen essentially became stepdad to Mia Farrow's children, also had a son with her. And years later, Mia Farrow discovered an inappropriate portrait of her daughter on Woody Allen's mantle. All right, so keep in mind, essentially Woody Allen is stepdad to Soon-Yi, and there's an inappropriate picture of her on his mantle, and the truth came out about the nature of their relationship. Now, what's interesting about this is regardless of where you fall in your view of sexual ethics, if your view is on a more conservative side, that sexual ethics is between a man and a woman in the context of marriage, or you're on the more progressive side where the guideline is consent, almost all would agree that this is outside of those boundaries. That it is outside of the boundaries because the structure of power and authority of a stepdad, and even if it's an adult child, like there is an imbalance of power. So for everybody on that spectrum would come to the conclusion that it's just not okay. And in an interview where Woody Allen describes the nature of his relationship, there's no remorse, no regret, no apology, not even moral confusion. He simply explains himself and says, well, the heart wants what the heart wants. And so I wonder if sometimes what the heart wants isn't actually the best guide. That maybe having an honest view of the wretchedness that sometimes points your heart in the wrong direction, sometimes we need to say, well, maybe what my heart wants is not good. That sometimes maybe my heart is selfish. That sometimes maybe my heart is spiteful. Now, there's an alternative denial that happens on the opposite end of the spectrum, and that would be an obsession with wretchedness. An obsession with wretchedness can be a denial of dignity. Finding ourselves so focused with the brokenness and wretchedness and the sin in our world can lead us to miss the reality that human beings are made in the image of God, that humans are different. That can happen in a couple different ways. One could be in a more atheistic, agnostic kind of worldview, a worldview that takes a sense of, well, we're all just animals. The view that we're all just animals, that humans are just chimps and chimps do terrible things. That would be a more agnostic worldview that basically sees it all as wretched. That we can't escape it. It's all wretched. People just do what people are going to do. Boys will be boys. It's just the way that it is. And there's a sense that you can't really expect anything more from people. There's going to be wars. There's going to be violence. There's going to be bloodshed. Now, you can Christianize this too and just say we're just sinners. Right? So it's not even just like a non-Christian thing. Christians can do the same thing with sin, and we are sinners. Like that's a true statement. But believing we can't do any better could be missing the dignity of what God created us to be as human beings, for us to live in His likeness. And so for us, how do we see something different? There's another kind of obsession with wretchedness that I saw growing up that I want to highlight for you. Now, before I highlight it, I want to mention my parents, because my parents, growing up as a Christian in the 90s was really weird. Like there was a lot of weird rules, a lot of weird things. We couldn't watch The Simpsons, couldn't listen to secular music. And so I want to share an example. My parents didn't know any better when they brought us to this, but it highlights a view that within the Christian experience that some people have in the way they emphasized wretchedness. And so some context, if you're not a Christian, if you didn't grow up Christian, some of this may be a little bit weird. But when I grew up in the Christian church, like Halloween was off limits. Like Christians we couldn't celebrate Halloween. Like you could hand out Bible tracts, but not candy. Or you could even dress up and get candy at church, but you just couldn't do it in your neighborhood. So like that Halloween was off limits. It's the devil's holiday. Some people still believe this. We couldn't go to haunted houses, but what we did go to was a thing called a hell house, which was just a Christian haunted house. And now the haunted house started with what you would expect from something like this. It started out, and it wants to help you be aware of the scariness of the satanic. And so candles, sorcery, chanting, a seance kind of scene, making sure that you are scared of the reality that there is a spiritual battle out there. And then we moved on. And when we moved on, it got significantly scarier. And so it continued to try. The goal was to scare the hell out of people, right? To make sure that you are terrified of the wretchedness of this world so that you just made sure that you would not be like those people. And so the next scene was a diorama of an abortion clinic, highlighting two different kinds of wretchedness, abortion, but also highlighting what happens if you have premarital sex. And so it was a bloody hospital room. All right, terrifying to see that as a kid, but as Christian. Now, for some reason, I kept going. I was terrified at this point, and so we moved into another scene. It was a funeral scene. And it wasn't like funerals that I have attended, because most of my experience at that point had been funerals like here, like with people who went to church here, and those funerals were Jesus-centered, gospel messages, hope-filled messages. But in this funeral scene, there was a pastor who stood up in front of the room delivering a hopeless turn or burn message, warning everyone about the fires of hell. And now I want to share something about that is incredibly painful. And if you have church hurt, especially if you are somebody who has experienced pain from Christians because of your own struggles with sexuality, I am so sorry. Because the thing that I experienced in that moment next, if I struggled with my sexuality, I'm not sure I would have followed Jesus after it. And so the next thing that happened in that funeral sermon is the preacher explained to us that the wretchedness of this man, that he was a gay man who died, and now we were invited to walk into the casket down into the depths of hell. And that's when I got the hell out of there. Their approach was like, well, maybe if we make sure you realize the wretchedness of this world, maybe if you realize the reality of the terrible sin, like whatever it is, then maybe we would experience the love of God. And so when I hear stories about people who are like, I just don't know if I want to be a part of this thing in the church, there's parts of me that get it. Because if that's the experience of God, that's not the God that I follow. The God I follow responds differently when it comes to wretchedness. In verse 13, he says, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. See, there's a view of wretchedness that lives in denial of any of it. There's a view of wretchedness that says that's all there is. There's a view of wretchedness that says you are on a hell-paved path and change or else. And then there's a view of wretchedness that says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. You know what's fascinating to me about that song, Amazing Grace? We haven't canceled it yet. John Newton, who wrote the song, was a slave trader. And he wasn't repentant of selling human beings when he wrote the line that saved a wretch like me. But also, I think it makes the song really, really powerful for me. Because when you say, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, the grace of God is true even for the things that you haven't realized yet. Even for the things that you might not realize until you're face to face with Jesus. That the grace of God, that there is no bounds on the grace of God, that there is no sin that can't be covered by the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so what if? What if a proper view of our own wretchedness also meant a proper view of our potential? What if connected to having a view of humanity, that there is a reality of wretchedness, also meant we had a higher view of humanity? Think of it. If you called a queen a wretch, the only reason you would ever call a queen a wretch is if the queen was living like a rat. Now, you wouldn't call a rat a wretch, you would call a rat, because rats doing what rats do is not wretched, it's just their nature. An animal living like an animal is just the nature of that animal. But the queen living like a rat, a queen living like an animal is wretched because the queen would not be living up to who she is meant to be. The only way you can call yourself or somebody else wretched is if you also realize the potential to do something different. For you to look to humanity and believe that things should be different. For you to look at the world and say things should not be the way they are. There shouldn't be violence the way there is. There shouldn't be hatred the way there is. There should be love and kindness and peace. That view means you see both wretchedness and the potential of human beings. That you, maybe even if you aren't following Jesus, there's this part of you that says humans could be better. That comes by understanding that there is a human propensity to screw things up. Maybe some of you aren't even sure about Jesus, but you are on your way already to the biblical conclusion that humanity is meant to be different, that humanity is meant to be a people of love, that humanity is meant to be at peace, that humanity is meant to be more than wretched. And so what Jesus does, in a only Jesus kind of way, is he wants to make sure that we are all aware, that we start with ourselves. Because as much as we can point to the world out there and the wretchedness of this world, Jesus wants to make sure we begin with the wretchedness inside of us. And he does so with this incredibly powerful verse, Matthew 5:48. He says, "But you are to be perfect even as your Father in heaven is perfect." Jesus demands the impossible. And for a long time, I've struggled with this verse. Like, why would Jesus demand the impossible? Why would God do that to us? And I don't think it's just so we can try harder. I actually think it has everything to do with our own wretchedness. Because if you strive for perfection, there is no avoiding your wretchedness. In the demand for perfection, you can't help but come face to face with your propensity for wretchedness. You can't strive for perfection without seeing your own failure. And in realizing your own wretchedness, it's the humility that Jesus invites us to have, to be honest. To be honest as we turn to God. And in turning to God, God doesn't form us into our most authentic version of ourselves. It's something better. He forms us into an identity he's given to us. That by the power of his own life, death, and resurrection, by the power of the Holy Spirit who lives in us, he forms us into his likeness. And so what do we do with that? What I want to offer for you is a practice that has happened for thousands of years in the Christian church, a practice called confession. And so I'm not talking about like with a priest or in a confessional or anything like that. I just want to give you something that you can integrate this into your daily or weekly rhythms of life. And so what I want to encourage you, sometime over the course of the next week, I want you to practice confession, to pick another person in your life, preferably a Christian, somebody who trusts Jesus. If you're not a Christian, I think you can still practice this as well. But I want to encourage you. I want you to, with another person, I want you to pray. And in praying, I want you to start by ask God to show you your wretchedness. Invite God to speak to your thoughts, your words, your actions. Pay attention to what's weighing on you in your own inability to be perfect. In a little bit, we'll practice this collectively. I think there's something even more powerful doing it one-on-one with another person, though. And if you're not used to asking God to show you something, just pay attention to what comes to mind. Now, as you ask God to show you your own sin, my encouragement to you is if you hear something that's convicting of your own sin, it will come in kindness and love and with gentleness. That's the voice of God. If you hear something that is condemning you and shaming you and beating you up, that's the voice of the enemy pointing you to something that Jesus has already tried to work through with you. And so God will speak to your sin. He's not going to avoid your wretchedness. He's just never going to leave you there. And so then I want you to pay attention to those things. Pay attention to sin in your own family, you're at work, with friends, with faith. And then the confession part is you tell a person. You out loud say it to another person. Confess it to them like you're telling it to God. And then for the person if you're on the receiving end of that confession, your opportunity is to respond like Jesus does. In fact, you may not have any time in your life where you have more of an opportunity to respond like Jesus. And so that means withhold any lectures or advice you have. Like you might have some solutions to the things they're confessing, hold that out. You might feel like there's some things they should be confessing that they're not bringing up. Hold that out. This is not the time. Hear their confession and do what Jesus would do and say, your sins are forgiven. Because Jesus responds to our wretchedness, not with a lecture, but with love. And the reason I encourage doing that with another person is simple. Because when we do that together here, which we're going to in just a minute, when we do that together here, you can confess silently in your heart, and you can look up here and be like, well, he doesn't know. He doesn't know what I did. He doesn't know what I said. He doesn't know what I thought. And it's true. I don't. The Holy Spirit isn't speaking to me, telling me all of your sin. I don't know the things. But when you say it out loud to another person, they know. They know it. And so what I will announce to all of you, another person who hears the thing weighing on you can look you in the eye, and you can't question if it's for somebody else because it's only you in the room. And so what I want to do is I want to close in prayer and model what that could look like. But in doing that, I want to encourage you to do the same thing sometime this week with somebody in your life. Jesus, we thank you for being a God who loves us. We thank you for the realistic view that you have of humanity, a view that is honest, a view that is honest about our own sin, about our own failures. God, many of us come into this room in denial of our own wretchedness, denial maybe because we don't want to even believe there is any wretchedness, maybe a denial because we want to excuse it because everybody else is the same, or maybe in denial because we just want to point out the evils of somebody else's wretchedness. All of it is a failure to deal with our own wretchedness, to deal with our own sins. And so, God, we pray that you would bring to our heart and our mind our own sin. Not to shame us or embarrass us, but to gently show us an honest view of ourselves. Show us the ways we've sinned, the ways we failed to love others well, to love ourselves well. Jesus, give us a view of that wretchedness that also helps us see the dignity that you give us. Because in our being honest, we also realize you created us for more. That you created us for love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, goodness, self-control. Help us to see the significance and the goodness of what you created in us. Give us an identity that doesn't stem from our own inner feelings, but an identity that comes from your voice. the words of Jesus in response to your wretchedness. God hears your honest confession. And the way Jesus responds to you. And these are not my words, these are Jesus' words. Your sins are forgiven. He's not lecturing you. He is loving you, embracing you, and walking with you wherever you are. Because that is who he is. In a life